Okay, welcome to the Old Gold Soccer podcast once again. I think this is edition 3, and it's Blakey on deck along with KP from the old SBS days. Hello, Kyle.
Hello, Blakey.
How are you?
I'm very good, mate. I'm feeling energised by this great dose of nostalgia. They say it's a drug, but it's legal, I believe. It's not going to get us any trouble. We can't traffic it, but we are loving getting back into the old soccer era.
No, it's fantastic.
And the great thing we're trying to do is help the people who don't understand what the NSL was or old soccer was, trying to help them understand the lessons that can be learned for today in new football, and also to celebrate.
There is no new football.
Well, there
is. Just the
there is. It's official.
It's the same thing.
I read it in the Daily Telegraph, the Herald Sun. It must be true. The Murdoch Press.
Of course.
But today we're to celebrate the important part of the Old Gold Soccer podcast is the gold that we saw, the gold in personalities, in players, in coaches. Kick it off, Blakey, with some of those great personalities.
Well, we haven't done enough of that, have we? Look, the Mavericks of the game, and we've had some beauties over the years. The players that just stood out for they made you laugh, they made you cry, they made you angry, for whatever reason. And I'll start with, before I do actually, I just want to make mention too of the top that I've got for this particular podcast. I'm not sure if there's vision to this, but I'm wearing the 1980 Grand Final Heidelberg United top, and I wear it proudly in memory of 3 great people in the game, and they were Paddy Bannon, the late Paddy Bannon, one of, how many brothers? There was Pat, there was Jed, Vince, and was there 3 or 4?
There was a younger one.
There was, wasn't there?
Stay tuned, we'll come back. Come back.
The late Paddy Bannon, the late Arthur McMillan, of course. If you've ever watched the 1980 Grand Final between Heidelberg United and Sydney City, you've got to see the challenge of Arthur McMillan on Ken Bowden. He literally sent Ken Bowden airborne off the field of play and onto the running track.
Right.
And he didn't get sent off for it. It was a different time. And the other person, the late Jimmy Williams, who was in the squad for Heidelberg, and Jimmy Williams, who became a club legend down at the Eastern Lions here in Victoria.
Where I met him. It's one of my old clubs. They were Waverley City in those days. But Jimmy was a legend down there.
Absolutely.
As a coach and a mentor.
And he was one of the Heidelberg players of that era. But the Mavericks, and I talk about the first person I remember absolutely is Ulysses Kokinos, who was I've got to mention George Best as well. I've got something to tell you about that. Can I just segue into very quickly?
No, I want to hear about Ulysses.
I'll tell you about Cocky. I just want to mention though, we talked about the soccer. Using the word soccer. If you've got a copy, which I have, of George Best's autobiography written with Michael Parkinson, George Best refers to soccer in every different occasion without apologies. I'm just making the point.
Okay, good. He's on my side. Not yours.
He's on. Well, he's on. I know. What are we oppositional now? Ulysses Kokinos. He was an amazing man, and I only really found out the full extent of it in later years, before he passed on quite recently. And he told me, some stories about models and all sorts of. But he had a great afro thing, and he was probably the first player in Victoria to stand out from the rest because of the personality he was. And you'd go to Middle Park and the crowd would cocky, and he was just a magnificent beast of a player. He knew, he was like a great racehorse. He knew how to play to the crowd,
Yeah. And I believe he brought some much needed publicity to the game at the time. And you mentioned models. There was some allegation about a massage table incident where somebody's amorous behaviour got the better of them. I don't know whether it was Ulysses or the model. I don't know what, but it made a splash in that great Melbourne newspaper, The Truth. Ran it on the front page for about 5 days in a row. I think it even made the evening news at some point.
He got up to, he scandalous for his time, and I know he did a nude or near nude photo shoot at one point as well. I can't remember what for. The great tragedy for me is that I only met Cocky through his connections with Heidelberg, and I spent a bit of time with him in the 2 Christmas periods prior to his passing, which was not, I'm just gibbering, but the stories he told me, and he said to me, here's my number, I want you to come down, because he lived quite near the beach down Brighton Way. And he said, come down, we'll sit on the beach for a couple of days and you can record all of this stuff. So you've got it and you can use it. And he passed away before we got around to doing that.
Terrible.
Which was really, really sad. But Ulysses Kokinos, the first of the great Mavericks of our time, and you can go right through. I was going to reference, I think, I don't think he was the best player by any means in the NSL era, but I remember Con Butsianis. I just thought he was one of those blokes that he was a jaw dropper. He took your breath away. He did things that other players couldn't. He was audacious. And I loved the story because you remember his winning goal in the 1997-98 grand final against Carlton, which is very controversial. Paul Trimboli spinning on a sixpence with a left footer into the path of Butsianis, took out Sean Douglas.
Who might have Sean Douglas went down.
And he scored the goal.
Amid vociferous cries, referee, free kick.
And then, of course, there was a bit of...
Just on Con before we move on, as well, famous for teaching his pet cockatoo, or was it galah, to scream, hair lust, hair lust. And I put that on national TV. Not one of the high points of my investigative journalism career, Blakey, but we made the cockatoo famous.
No, that was... and look, he was flamboyant. He had... there was the issues after that grand final. He went off to Perth, and I was very, very fortunate at the time to be working with C7 and covered a lot of those Perth games. And oh my God, he was just a wonderfully look. I can't think of the adjectives that I'd really want to apply to him. But I love watching competitions. But what I loved the most was when he came back to South Melbourne. And this was one of my favourite. And this is from a Heidelberg supporter. But he came back to South Melbourne midway through. I think it was the 2000-2001 season. South Melbourne, second bottom of the ladder. Halfway through the season, they were done. They were cooked. They were buggered, right? Con Butsianis was with the Auckland Kings at the time, with a Z. Do they even know how to spell? I mean, seriously. Anyway.
There's a whole episode on dopey names. We'll come back to that.
Yes. So he came back. He got a transfer back from the Kings to South Melbourne halfway through the year. And it was on the proviso that his first game back, they were hosting the Auckland Kings at Bob Jones Stadium. And, of course, they played him in that game and he scored the winner against the Auckland Kings. He scored about 8 or 9 goals in the second half of the year, and some of them were just crackers. And South Melbourne went from second bottom of the ladder into the finals that year. And he was just special. And I still think now the most exciting team I've seen I saw in the NSL was that particular era. They had the four horsemen of the apocalypse. They had Coveney, Lozanovsky, Butsianis and Trimboli, and then on the bench they had John Anastasiadis. Holy moly, they were exciting.
Great names. I'd like to pick out a guy called Jonesy, John Markovsky. Correct me if I'm wrong, Blakey. I think one of the youngest debuts in the NSL at 15.
15, yep.
He was a giant of a man and incredible skills for a big guy.
And a remarkable mullet as well as a
great
kid.
Mullet. And an attitude that the more people came at him, like defenders or other supporters, the more people came and said, we're going to get you, Jonesy, or you're this, Jonesy, he would just lap it up and somehow grow another foot, another as a giant. And also personality, you wouldn't get away with this today. When he was playing for Morwell Falcons, I got word that Jonesy would hire the local old person's home high-ace van with the seats in it, pick up the 5 or 6 players in Melbourne's western suburbs, drive across town to Morwell for training, get a big Mac attack on the way home. And I thought that would be a great story just to summarise what these guys are meant to be pros are doing, expecting Jonesy to say, I can't do that, KP, because if my coach might have been Bobby McLaughlin, I can't remember, if the coach sees how we carry on and get Maccas, that'll be the end of me. I was expecting him to say that. You know what he said? He said, great. He said, not only that, you can put the camera on the bus. So we had a camera on the bus, Jonesy hooning around the west of Melbourne, picking up players, making about the 2-hour drive to Morwell for training. And then, of course, straight after training, none of this high-protein drinks or ice bars, straight to Macca's for a full-on Mac attack, Cokes, fries, the lot for the big trip back to Melbourne. What a player.
He was an incredible player and another one of those jaw droppers. Look, there's been so many over the time. I mean, my original sort of folk hero was Gary Cole, who I thought was and it's always the goal scorers, isn't it? But Gary Cole, he used to. I used to imagine, because he had this blonde lock of blonde, big. And I used to imagine him driving into the car park at Olympic Park with a surfboard on the roof of a station.
Except he was English.
Except he was English, yeah. But it's just look.
On that note, let me come back with one, because I was actually talking to a tradie the other day who came to my house and recognised me, which was nice, and wanted to talk about. This is in Sydney. He wanted to talk about Sydney Olympic, the sister club of South Melbourne, and he has his favourite player was Marshall Soper. Now, Marshall Soper was a guy way out there, way out beyond Pluto, way out of our atmosphere, to the point where one fame, and he was a great goal scorer. But Marshall seemed to have this uncanny knack of getting himself in the middle of trouble. So, for example, the infamous Pratton Park riot, who was at ground zero? Jerry Gomez and Marshall Soper. One of the great things about Marshall as well, as we were football journos back in those days, he was always a headline, the human headline. So there was one day at St George Stadium where the St George fans were giving it to him, which is hard to do.
There's only
7 of them. He got taken off by his coach. Might have actually been the famous Tommy Doherty. I can't remember exactly. threw his jumper on the ground, gestured at the crowd. The coach was an idiot, and I thought, this is not going to end well. Game finishes. He does an interview with Les Murray on SBS, and he retires from all football. He says, I've had a gutful. This club's rubbish. These fans are rubbish. He gave it to everybody. I'm out. The coach of St George at that time was Frank Arrock, who wanted to pick him for the next Socceroo game. As Marshall's about to head up the tunnel, Arrock goes, Marshall, come here. Calls him back, waves a finger like a naughty boy, says, you're going to go back in front of that camera, you're going to apologise to everybody, and you're going to unretire. Nah, not doing it. Marshall, you're going to go and do that. And what did Marshall do? He went back to the camera. He apologised to his coach, to the fans, unretired, and played on for another 5 or 6 years. Great character.
Marshall Soper, and that reminds me too, when we've been talking a bit about the Socceroos. I remember when John Cosmina, I wish I'd never met him. We have to do a series on people we wish we hadn't met, because he was a hero of mine, Cosmina. He really was. And when Cosmina and Soper were up front for the Socceroos, and that would have been when
85, 86, when Arrock was coach.
That was back in the time, and you don't see it anymore, when we had attacking players who would terrify defenders with their physicality, their unapologetic, and they weren't taking it. These days, you don't see that. There was Peter Ollerton was another, and Gus McLeod was another. And they're all big, burly forwards, and they didn't take any of the nonsense they got from defenders. They were actually as intimidating as the defenders.
Correct. One of the things about this era of old soccer, NSL, call it what you wish, was there wasn't a lot of media managers around. There wasn't a lot of spin doctors. No. There wasn't a lot of wellness coaches. There wasn't a lot of mentors saying, settle down, son. These guys, their personalities came out. And so it wasn't just that the fans knew them for being flamboyant players. They knew that off the pitch, you're going to see something. You're not going to find an answer, someone saying, we just take 1 week at a time. I mean, shoot me, Blakey. Shoot me. The personalities is what I miss about absolutely. That era. Yep. And guys like who are, let's put another great name, Alan Davidson, another South Melbourne legend, not short of confidence and not shy to say to people when he was playing well or badly. He was his hardest critic. Yep. But when Davo was playing well, and he played a lot of great footy for South Melbourne before he went up to Malaysia. Yep. He was like a prince. He literally was a prince. He's an elegant player. He wasn't a guy who was physical, but again, had the confidence, and the fans loved that. They really did.
Look, the great characters and the coaches that you're talking about as well. As you said, there's no media managers. They didn't have press conferences. You had to go and sort your, You mentioned 2 people, Bobby McLaughlin. I'll tell you a quick story about Bobby. And I thought he didn't have a great lot of success, to be honest. No. But he was...
He loved the game more than it loved him, shall we say.
And he was wonderful. At one point, he was coaching Footscray JUST, and they got hammered in a game. I think it might have been against Brisbane City. I can't remember. But they ended up going down 4-0 or 4-1, something like that. And I went to the dressing rooms, as you had to back then, and Bobby put his arm around my shoulder. He said, Blakey, what'd you think of that second half? And I said, that was complete shite, Bob. That was crap. And he said, yeah, I agree with you. Anyway, he sort of pulled me into the dressing room in front of all these sweating,
to give your assessment.
And he said, Ray, it's not me saying this, boys. Blakey said, you were straight.
At which point, knowing the NSL players, they probably want to chase you out and beat the hell out of you.
I was backing up the truck as quick as I could, but you'd look back, all of that stuff, I'm just going to say, it all went so quickly. Tommy Doherty, he was down, he coached, I think was it Olympic?
Yeah, coached Olympic.
Against Preston, out at Connor Reserve. And I went down because you had to go and source this yourself. And, this is a bloke that just finished coaching Manchester United, etc.
Not long before, yeah.
And I knocked on the door and I said, is the coach about? And he came he didn't know me. And he looked around quizzically. He said, where the F am I?
That's right. There'd be a few people who got that shock in Australia because they thought it was professional football. Look, the other great names, you mentioned John Cosmina, ferocious player to the point where, in fact, he could have played any combat sport. He could have played AFL.
Oh, he was incredible.
Rugby league, rugby union. Cosy was just such a fierce competitor. It's a shame, though, he did get a gig with Arsenal and came back within 1 year because I don't know whether it was homesickness or whether in those days the Poms weren't ready for like a full-blooded Errol Flynn style, centre forward. But in terms of, I mentioned him before, Frank Arrock. You talk about PR for the game. Frank Arrock, a former journalist, a rare beast who'd gone from journalism to coaching football. He was so clever. What he would do when he was coaching the Socceroos and he was coming to Melbourne, he would ring me. I was a Melbourne reporter in those days for Soccer Action. No, sorry, for SBS. And he'd say, look, you didn't hear it from me, but I think I might be picking a couple of these great young Melbourne players. Oh, who? Ange Postecoglou was one of the players he picked. Ange made his debut for the Socceroos against Czechoslovakia at Olympic Park. Now, what Eric would do by that, genius as he was, he'd give the Melbourne press a story. He'd put a young Melbourne kid like Ange into the media. He'd add 5,000 or 6,000 to the gate because in those days the Socceroos didn't automatically sell out. He knew that picking Ange from South Melbourne, suddenly half the Hellas fans would come. He was a genius. He was a hard-working guy. We used to almost mow the lawn at St George Stadium. In fact, he nearly killed himself one day because they bought a new electric motor and it had just been raining and Frank didn't understand the dynamics of electricity and water. Nearly killed himself. But Frank Garrett, what a character.
Yeah, and he really, really was. The greatest disservice he was ever done, apart from them getting rid of him. Just on Cosmina quickly, don't get me wrong, for some reason, Cosy never liked me. And every time I engaged with him...
That was very important to you, wasn't it, that he liked you?
No, it just frightened me. It really did. I remember once when he was coaching the Newcastle Breakers, I think it was, and it was his 100th game as coach or something like that. And I said, John, well done, congratulations. And I might have just gone up and told him, I'd just stolen your car or something. He just glared at me. But every time I engaged with John Cosmina, it was I didn't care if he liked me. I just wish he didn't hate me because he was a hero playing for the Socceroos. He was sensational. You'd want him out there for the tough games.
Oh, absolutely. He was. Look, we can say this without being contradicted. Cosmina leading the Sydney City Slickers was probably the greatest, toughest band of footballers ever to pull on a club shirt in Australia.
Yes.
They were, I won't say murderers, that's too much. They left scars on every team they played against. They were ferociously tough.
It's funny you mentioned that because I was talking before about Arthur McMillan against Sydney City in that 1980 grand final. I do know, and I won't go into detail because we're running out of time, but I do know that was the day when the Heidelberg players of that era, Tansy, McMillan, all these blokes, got together and said, we're not going to get pushed around by these bastards anymore. Yeah. Today's the day.
You got to get your retaliation in first.
And they really, really did, Now,
I'm going to finish, Blakey. I know your favourite all-time player, I'm not going to say his name.
In the NSL.
Mm-hmm. He did play for the Socceroos. Mm-hmm. So you give me now, after all the seasons you watched, and you probably watched every year from 77 when you were a Cub fan, right the way through to demise in 2003-4. Mm-hmm. Who was the greatest ever player you saw in the NSL?
Paul Trimboli. Paul Trimboli. And this is a player that didn't have a lot of speed, didn't have a lot of pace, shall we? He couldn't shoot from a distance, but he He was inspiring as a skipper. He was only slightly built. He got knocked about. He'd just get up, dust himself off. None of this histrionics and rolling over and he was sublimely skilled and so intelligent as a player. And off the field, one of the most unassuming champions of the game I've ever met. And I think as a package, Paul Trimboli by a mile was the best player.
Okay.
You know,
I have to say, in my experience, and I was lucky to get a call from Branko Kalina, who was coach of Melbourne Knights, who gave me a tip and said, there's a kid at the AIS. He's going so well, they've agreed to loan him back to us for the last 8 weeks of the season. He started on the bench in the number 16 shirt. Guy called Mark Viduka.
Wasn't bad.
He came on at half time, and the National Soccer League was never the same again. He was a very athletic guy, but his skill was such. He, at that time, made defenders, they were scared to go near him because they knew he was going to make a goose of them. Viduka then, and you've got this history I know in your pocket, I think the next year, his first full season was under 21 Player of the Year, top goal scorer. What else?
And then he did the same thing the following season. So 2 years in a row, he was top goal scorer, under 21 Player of the Year, and Player of the Year in 2 seasons, and he still wasn't 21 years of age.
Unbelievable.
I'll tell you quickly that one of the we were talking before off air about the great games. Preliminary final 93, 94 it may have been, or a little bit after.
Was this the big Mudbath game?
The Mudbath game.
Yeah, Mudbath.
Melbourne Knights, South Melbourne.
And it had been raining all morning and all day.
Viduka had just gotten off the plane from the World Youth Championships on the Friday.
Yeah.
So he was, you didn't, wow. Anyway, Danny Tiato got sent off about 12 minutes in, so they were down by a player. Viduka, 3 goals in 26 minutes on either side of half-time. Like that. Gee, he just did it. And it was like, wow, you're right. He was a great champion, but if you're talking about longevity, Paul Trimboli.
Okay, so there you go. Blakey's going for Paul Trimboli as the best player he saw in the NSL era. I'm going with Mark Viduka, but we're going to come back, Blakey, and do more episodes on this because we've left a lot of great players out. We haven't had the time. We could go on forever. They deserve to be called out. We will be back. This is the Old Gold Soccer Podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening. Catch us anywhere. Tell your friends about us. Go to Spotify, Google Play, wherever. And also catch us on TikTok and Instagram. Until next time, I'm KP.
I'm Blakey.
See you next time on the Old Gold Soccer Podcast.